Publishing put out called Music and Medicine. So they're looking for the kinds of studies that we're talking about that are done well, and they in their own right can publish those papers. So we have to make inroads using these techniques, and it's important in a multidisciplinary meeting like this, where we all come from different backgrounds, that we at least have a little bit of a common ground about the philosophy of science and how we're going to move a field from the arts into science and medicine. Now, I have to go through again, for common ground purposes, a little bit of brain anatomy, and what I will not do is enumerate the 40+ areas of Brodmann and tell you where they are in the cerebral hemispheres. I never found this useful as a student. But there are other reasons that this doesn't apply. One is that it's a purely anatomical method. So what Brodmann did was take a dead brain, slice it up into microscopic sections, look at it under the microscope. Some cells look like triangles, some cells look like circles. There are 6 layers, and you say, well, are the big circles and big triangles in layer 4 or 3? And how many different areas can I identify based on the distribution of triangles or pyramidal cells and circles or granular cells in the 6 layers of the cerebral cortex? That's the game. That's the science. Okay, and it's a very important piece of microanatomy, and it carries this great term, cytoarchitecture. It sounds really important. But it's actually not useful when we talk about function. For example, when Economo and Koskinas broke up the brain and looked at it under a microscope, they came up with 107 areas. So this is the problem of the eye of the beholder. We want to get away from the problems, even within science, of sitting at the master's feet and reproducing what the master does and doing it in the eye of the beholder. And furthermore, what we're really interested in is how anatomy relates to behavior. It's going to be hard to get that out of a dead brain, right? So I've never really found, although in certain ways it's useful in certain aspects of neuroscience, for our purposes today, I don't really think we should go through the 24 Brodmann's areas. What we can do is talk about the cerebral cortex as an amazing computational machine. The cerebral cortex is, if you imagine aluminum foil, right? A piece of aluminum foil that's as big as, let's say, a small Domino's pizza. All right. Now, although it's thin, that sheet of aluminum foil does have a thickness. And you can wrinkle that aluminum foil up, right? And by wrinkling it up, you can fit more aluminum foil in a Tupperware than if you didn't fold it up, right? Well, that's what evolution has done with the human cerebral cortex. You know, we are the kings and queens in the animal kingdom of the human cerebral cortex. So it's a 3-millimeter thick sheet, okay, the size of about a small Domino's pizza. And in that area and thickness, there are approximately 20 billion neurons, or the information processing units of the brain. And each of those neurons, on average, makes about 1,000 connections. So there are 20 trillion connections. We used to joke in the lab about Carl Sagan and the cosmos. There are billions of, right? It's kind of the same thing for the brain. There are 20 trillion connections in the brain. Right? And you're making them all the time and losing them all the time. The whole use it or lose it principle in neurobiology relates in many ways to the cerebral cortex and those connections that we're making all the time. We really don't make many neurons past about mid-gestation to late gestation as fetuses. Making neurons is not what we do, but we do make connections and do prune those connections. One of the problems with autism has to do with pruning at age at 2 years old, but still have this enormous. So if you can imagine the computational power, there's no computer that can do with sound what your auditory system can do, all right, or with vision that your auditory system can do. And the seat, if you will, Aristotle had it wrong. He thought it was the heart, and he was very disrespectful because Hippocrates was 200 years older than Aristotle, and he'd already done lesion effect experiments. The seat of intellectual and aesthetic life, for the most part, is this cerebral cortex. Fortunately, so on the right you have a normal, on the left you have an Alzheimer's disease brain, and you can see the atrophy in the Alzheimer's disease brain. And the Alzheimer's is a disease of the cerebral cortex. Now, fortunately, there are only so many lobes. There's a frontal lobe, there's a temporal lobe, there's a parietal lobe, there's an occipital lobe, and then the structures underneath, which I'll call the subcortex. So rather than remembering all these different Brodmann's areas or gyri, let's try to stick with the basic lobes of the brain. And the way they're defined as lobes are not by these bumps. They're called gyri. How many of you have ever had like a Greek hieros? It's the same root of the word. So you know how the gyros is like a rolled up sandwich? So these folds on the brain are called gyri. But it's these crevices between them, or sulci. So there's a big one here that separates the frontal and the parietal lobe. There's a big one here that separates the temporal from the frontal and parietal. And there's an imaginary one here that separates the occipital from the parietal. All right, so that's how when we look at the brain, if we have a model of the brain and we're to name these four lobes, if you can remember those four, it'll facilitate a little bit of what I'm going to talk about with functional brain organization. Now, I've tried to simplify this further from a functional perspective. Remember, those are still anatomical terms, right? They're about areas on the brain that you can give a name to for whatever that's worth. But really what we're interested in is how those areas function. And those types of brain areas, those functional zones, if you will, can be broken up into three basic types. There's the modality-specific type, which here is in red and blue. I don't know if we can get the lights down a little bit for the slide so that we can see at least the slide a little bit better. So these modality-specific neurons within the cerebral cortex, they're devoted to processing information in only one sensory modality or for movement. So there's a visual, there's an auditory, there's a touch, there's a movement area. So if we just keep that in mind, there are these modality-specific areas. But of course, we don't perceive the world, at least non-autistics, don't perceive the world as Humpty Dumpty, this incoherent, separate. I mean, think about your body, right? Your eyes are over here, your ears are over here, your skin is over there. So how do you put all of that together into a coherent whole of your body for sensory experience and movement? How does that happen? Well, one of the two major theories is that there's a convergence of these neurons. They send their connections to other neurons that are multimodal. So to excite those neurons, they'll only fire if you have a visual stimulus and an auditory stimulus co-registered. An example of this for all of you, very, very straightforward actually, is when you read. Don't you hear yourself read oftentimes? So you're putting together the sound of the word with the sight of the word. That's multimodal processing, right? And in fact, phonological processing deficits are the main problem for reading. Their auditory processing deficits are the main cause of dyslexia in children. It's actually not just reading the words, it's putting those symbols together with the sound. And of course, we don't have to be taught how to talk or how to do language. We do have to be taught how to read. Reading has only been around for, writing's only been around for about 4,000 years, but we've been talking forever. So that's another example. How many of you play a musical instrument? Okay, so that's a really clear example where you have the instrument. Think about, like imagine Judith up here, right? There's the movement of the hands and vocal cords. There's knowing spatially where your fingers are on the fretboard, right? Moving the fingers on the fretboard, hearing what you're playing, modifying what you're doing based on what you're hearing. And for those of you who read, you're also doing visual processing. And one of the reasons we talk about music as a great way to exercise the brain is because you're involving all of these modality-specific systems, including the vestibular system and the multimodal systems. So you're getting a lot of the brain activated when you're actually doing music, right? Even when you're dancing. Now the third area here that I called supramodal is really a relatively, at least a part of it is unique to humans. That is the processing of information above and beyond stimuli from the external world. So a lot of our internal lives, right? Who we are, really, we can all see, we can all walk, we can all hear, but we identify our individuality in relation to these supramodal areas, our memories and how we plan for the future, how we interact with society. In other words, supra is Greek for above or beyond. So this is the processing of the brain that goes above and beyond stimulus modality, above and beyond movement. So I always say the 7 deadly sins and the 7 virtues, right? They're in the domain of the supramodal cortical areas. And they're not, and we've developed them evolutionarily way beyond any other animal, including chimps, who we've separated from only about 7 million years ago. So it's hard to get philosophers to agree, but I think that most, if not all of them, would agree that there are 2 distinct realms of everyday experience: the inner self and the external world. And the photographs I have here are John Locke, the great 17th century British philosopher, on the left, and Immanuel Kant, the great 18th century German philosopher, on the right. So what nervous systems have done is to evolve specialized mechanisms for interfacing the inner self and the external world. So we have stimuli that impinge upon us from the external world, your eyes, your ears, your skin, and so forth. And those are all over different parts of the body. They get processed in the peripheral nervous system and spinal cord. Like the deep tendon reflex just goes right from the nerve to the spinal cord, back to the nerve, and back out to the muscles, bones, joints, and so forth, so that we can exert the force of our actions into the external world. So this is what's happening at the interface with the external world. So if we go higher in the processing of information in the nervous system, we come to that area I called the subcortex, or S. And the subcortex is reciprocal in that it feeds back down to the peripheral nervous system and spinal cord. And then the next level of processing within the system are these modality-specific cortical areas that I was mentioning: auditory, visual, tactile, motor. Those modality-specific areas project to the multimodal cortical areas that put together the different modalities and help solve the Humpty Dumpty problem. Okay? Now, I put a line here between the multimodal cortex and the inner self because, again, there's nothing particularly characteristic about each of us with respect to these other types of processing. And the multimodal cortex then projects higher. There's a concept here of lower and higher. Binary opposition, so important to structuralism and science and understanding how everything from different societies to the brain works. So there's a lower, higher dichotomy here in binary opposition. The highest level of processing is the supramodal cortex.